Hello guys, welcome back to Boring Historian. Tonight we are venturing into a world that has just been broken. We're not talking about the drama of a great battle or the fall of a king, but something far more intimate and terrifying. Imagine a world where the background noise of life, the hum of humanity that you take for granted, has suddenly been turned down by half. The air is clean, the sky is clear, but the silence is deafening. This is the world in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death. What you're about to hear might stick with you. It's a story about what happens on the day after the end of the world, and how the survivors began to pick up the pieces. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Alright, find your quiet space, let the outside world fade, and let's begin our journey. The year is 1352. The first, and by far the most savage wave of the Great Pestilence has finally burned itself out. You are a survivor. You step out of your small cottage into the morning air, and the first thing that strikes you is the silence. It's a profound and unnerving quiet that has settled over the landscape like a shroud. You stand and listen for the familiar sounds of village life, but they are gone. There is no distant shouting of children playing down the lane. No rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer from his forge. The cheerful, boisterous noise of life that once filled every moment has been replaced by an emptiness that echoes in your ears. You walk through your village, a place you have known your entire life, and it has become a land of ghosts. You pass the cottage of your neighbors, the Cobwell family. The door hangs open, creaking softly in the breeze. No smoke rises from their chimney. You know you will never see them again. Their dog, now thin and feral, watches you with wary eyes from the overgrown garden. You continue down the lane, and it's the same story everywhere. Every second or third house is dark, silent, empty. Their owners are gone, taken by the swift and merciless plague that swept through the valley last year. You look out beyond the village to the fields that stretch towards the woods. For centuries, this landscape was a neat and tidy patchwork of long plowed strips, each tended by a different family. Now, it is a ragged mess. Whole sections of the fields lie fallow, unplowed, and already sprouting a thick carpet of weeds and thistles. You can see the faint outline of the furrows, a ghostly reminder of the work that is no longer being done. On the lands belonging to the local lord, you can see last year's wheat, now blackened and rotten on the stalk. There were simply not enough hands left to harvest it. The great collective effort of agriculture, the rhythm of planting and reaping that has defined life for 1,000 years, has broken down. The sheer scale of the loss is almost impossible for you to comprehend. You know who has died in your own village, but you have heard travelers' tales that it is the same everywhere, from the southern coasts of Italy to the northern shores of England. Modern demographers and historians, looking back at the patchy records of the time, estimate that the Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire population of Europe in just a few short years. Think about that for a moment. It's a number so vast it feels abstract. But for you, it is not abstract at all. It is the empty stool by your hearth. It is the face of your child you can no longer remember clearly. It is the half-finished weaving still sitting on your neighbor's loom. The true death toll is something historians still argue about. The records are frustratingly incomplete. Tax rolls might suddenly show half the names crossed out. Parish records of births and deaths fall silent. Entire villages might vanish from the records altogether, their populations so completely annihilated that they were simply abandoned and forgotten. Was the final toll closer to a devastating 1/3, or a truly apocalyptic 1/2? In some densely populated regions, it may have been as high as 2/3. We will never know for sure. All you know is that the world you were born into, a world crowded with people, has become a world of empty spaces. This relentless, inexplicable loss has inflicted a deep and profound trauma on your mind and on the soul of your community. You are plagued by a gnawing sense of survivor's guilt. Why did you live? You look at your own hands, feel the breath in your own lungs, and wonder why you were spared when your spouse, your parents, or your children were taken. The pestilence made no sense. It killed the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the pious and the sinful with equal terrifying impartiality. The local priest, a man of God, died in agony, while the village drunkard, a man of vice, survived without a scratch. This randomness has shattered your belief in a just and ordered universe where good deeds are rewarded and sin is punished. The world now seems capricious and cruel, governed by a silent and seemingly indifferent God. Everywhere you look, you are surrounded by the tangible presence of absence. The tools leaning against a neighbor's wall, rusting in the rain. The half-full sack of grain in an abandoned cottage, now being feasted on by rats. Every object is a ghost, a silent testament to a life cut short. You live in a world of leftovers, a world of things that have outlasted their owners. It is a deeply melancholy existence, haunted by the memory of what and who has been lost. And beneath it all is a constant simmering fear. The sickness came like a storm and then receded. But what if it comes back? Every time a family member coughs, every time a child develops a fever, a cold dread clutches at your heart. You check their bodies for the telltale signs. The swollen, painful buboes in the armpit or groin, the dark patches on the skin that gave the plague its name. You have seen this horror before, and the fear that it could return at any moment is a poison that taints every day. If you lived in a large town or city like London or Florence, the experience was even more intense and horrifying. In the countryside, you might have space to bury your dead. In a crowded city, that quickly became impossible. At first, the authorities tried to maintain the normal Christian burials. Each body was washed, wrapped in a shroud, and given a service in the local churchyard. But as the death toll mounted from dozens a day to hundreds a day, this system collapsed complete. The churchyards were filled to capacity within weeks. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a constant, sweet, and sickly reminder of the pestilence. This is when the cities turned to a grim and practical solution: the plague pit. Chroniclers from the time describe how great, deep trenches were dug in fields outside the city walls. All day, carts would rumble through the streets, their drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead!" Bodies would be brought from the house, often entire families at once, and piled high onto the carts. The carts would then trundle out to the pits, where the bodies were unceremoniously tipped in like so much refuse. There were no individual prayers, no ceremony. Layers of bodies were interspersed with layers of quicklime to aid decomposition and hopefully quell the smell. Modern archaeologists, digging the foundations for new buildings in cities like London, still occasionally unearth these mass graves. The jumbled skeletons lying in the exact chaotic manner the chronicles describe. These pits are the starkest physical evidence of the moment when medieval society's ability to cope with death on this scale completely broke down. A wry observer might note that urban renewal projects had a very different and much grimmer meaning back then. But amidst the silence and the sorrow, you begin to notice other, stranger changes. With fewer humans around, the natural world is starting to rebound. The birdsong seems louder in the mornings. You see more deer at the edge of the woods, growing bolder now that there are fewer hunters. Wolves, once driven back into the deep forests, are reportedly being seen closer to the villages. The air itself feels cleaner. The rivers run clearer. The great heavy footprint of humanity on the landscape has been lightened, and nature is tentatively, cautiously, beginning to press back into the spaces that have been left behind. And there is another, more profound change taking root. You walk past the cottage of a family that was completely wiped out. The cottage, the garden, the strip of land they farmed in the common fields. Their tools, their cooking pot of everything is still there. But who does it belong to now? The rigid lines of inheritance, which have structured your society for centuries, have been completely tangled or erased. Entire family lines have vanished. For the first time, there is a surplus of the one thing that has always been impossibly scarce: land. You stand on a small hill and look out over your silent village as the sun begins to set. The world you were born into, the world of your parents and your grandparents, is gone. It was a world defined by its rigid structure. You were born a peasant. You would die a peasant. You worked the land of your lord. You obeyed the rules of the church. You accepted your place in the great chain of being. That world has been shattered, not by a war or a revolution, but by a microscopic organism that has scoured away the very people who held the structure in place. It is a terrifying, lonely, and uncertain world. You are adrift in a sea of grief, surrounded by the ghosts of your past. But as you stand there in the quiet twilight, a new feeling begins to stir, something you have never felt before. It is a strange and unsettling mix of fear and opportunity. In this new, empty world, the old rules no longer seem to apply. With so few people left to till the fields and shear the sheep, your life, your labor, your two strong hands, they are suddenly worth more than you could ever have possibly imagined. The silence is the sound of an old world dying, but it is also the sound of a new one waiting to be born. But as you stand there in the quiet twilight, a new feeling begins to stir. Something you have never felt before. Something you have never felt before. It is a strange and unsettling mix of fear and opportunity. In this new, empty world, the old rules no longer seem to apply. With so few people left to till the fields and shear the sheep, your life, your labor, your two strong hands, they are suddenly worth more than you could ever have possibly imagined. The silence is the sound of an old world dying, but it is also the sound of a new one waiting to be born. To understand the sheer magnitude of the change that is about to unfold, you must first remember the world that existed before the pestilence. It was a world of rigid, unbreachable structures. If you were born a peasant, you were a serf. This meant you were legally bound to the land you worked, which was owned by your lord. You were not a slave, but you were not truly free. You owed your lord a certain number of days of unpaid labor each week, known as corvée labor, working his personal fields, the demesne, to generate his wealth. You paid him rent for your own small plot of land, not usually in cash, but in chickens, eggs, or a share of your grain. You could not leave the manor. You could not marry someone from another village without his permission. You could not even have your own grain ground at a different mill. In essence, you were a part of his property, as much a fixture of the manor as the old oak tree on the hill. This system had been in place for centuries, an unchangeable fact of life. Now, the plague has smashed that system to pieces. The fundamental mathematics of the world have been turned upside down. Before, the equation was simple. There was a surplus of people and a scarcity of land. Lords held all the power because they controlled the land that everyone needed to survive. Now, the equation has flipped. Land is suddenly abundant. There are empty cottages and unworked fields everywhere you look. The scarce commodity, the precious resource, is now you. It is your labor. Imagine your lord, a man who survived the plague by isolating himself in his stone manor house. He looks out his window and sees his fields, the source of all his wealth, choked with weeds. The harvest is rotting. He needs workers, and he needs them now. He rides down to your village, expecting to command the handful of you who are left to get to work, just as he always has. He is about to encounter a peasant he has never met before. He is about to meet you. This is the moment where the world pivots. For the first time in your life, for the first time in your family's history, stretching back generations, you have leverage. The Lord orders you to report for your weak work, to come labor on his lands for free. You look at your fellow survivors, and a silent, unspoken understanding passes between you. You have seen too much death to be frightened by a nobleman's angry scowl. You refuse, or more likely, you make a counteroffer. You say, "I will work your land, my lord, but not for free. You must pay me in coin." The Lord is apoplectic. This is not just an argument over wages. It is an attack on the very fabric of his world. A serf does not make demands, but his anger is matched only by his desperation. He looks at his rotting crops. He looks at the vast empty fields. He looks at you, the only able-bodied worker for miles. And so, through gritted teeth, he agrees. He agrees to pay you a cash wage for your work. You press your advantage. You demand an end to the unpaid labor service. You demand a reduction in the rent you pay for your own cottage. He agrees because he has no choice. The power has shifted. But what if your lord is particularly stubborn? What if he refuses to bend, insisting on the old ways? In the world before the plague, his refusal would be the end of it. You would have no choice but to submit. But now, you have a radical, terrifying new option. You can leave. This is the true revolution. The bonds that tied you to this specific patch of earth have been dissolved by death. You pack your few belongings and walk away from the cottage your family has inhabited for 200 years. You are heading to the next manor over, where you heard the plague was even worse, and the new lord is young and desperate. This is the new phenomenon of the post-plague world, land shopping. You, a simple peasant, can now literally shop around for a landlord who will offer you the best deal. You might approach the reeve, the lord's manager, and strike a bargain that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. You'll take on the abandoned farmstead at the edge of the village, but you want it for a fraction of the old rent. Well, you will pay your rent in cash, not in chickens. You will owe no labor service, and you want the Lord to repair the roof of the cottage and throw in a new cow to sweeten the deal. It's a seller's market for labor, and you are the seller. You might even find yourself in a bidding war, with two different lords competing for your service, offering you better and better terms. It's a bit like a modern tech worker fielding offers from rival companies, except instead of stock options, you're negotiating for grazing rights. This sudden, dramatic shift in your economic power has an immediate and tangible impact on your life. You have cash in your pocket. For the first time, you are a wage-earning consumer. And what do you spend it on? You spend it on a better life. You begin to eat foods that were once the exclusive domain of the rich. You can afford more meat, and not just the tough, oversalted pork you preserved yourself, but fresher cuts from the butcher. You can afford to buy the better ale, the strong stuff, instead of just drinking the weak, small ale you made at home. You might even be able to afford bread made from maslin, the wheat-rye mix, instead of just coarse, dark rye bread. Your diet, once a grim rotation of pottage and gritty bread, becomes more varied, more nutritious, and infinitely more delicious. This period has been called, by some historians, the golden age of the English peasantry. It is a prosperity born directly from the ashes of the plague. Of course, the ruling class, the great nobles, the king, and his parliament does not sit back and watch this happen with amusement. They are horrified. They see a world turned upside down. In their eyes, the surviving peasants are getting arrogant, lazy, and greedy. They are profiting from the deaths of millions, refusing to work unless bribed with outrageous wages, and abandoning their sworn duties to their masters. They see the very foundations of their ordered society crumbling into chaos. And so, they fight back, using the one tool they still control: the law. Across Europe, Governments rushed to enact legislation to stop this peasant paradise in its tracks. In England, the king issues the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws were a desperate attempt to turn back the clock. They made it illegal for an employer to offer, or a worker to demand, wages higher than the levels that existed in 1346, the year before the plague hit. They declared that every able-bodied person under the age of 60 must work for anyone who required it. They even made it illegal for you to leave your lord's service. They tried, with the full force of the law, to chain you back to the land and put you back in your pre-plague box. So, was this new golden age for laborers a reality, or was it stamped out before it could truly begin? This is where historians still argue. Did the economic changes happen immediately, or was there a significant lag as the nobility used its legal power to resist the tide? Some argue that these new laws were effective, at least for a time. The threat of fines and imprisonment was real, and many peasants were forced to accept the old terms. The transition, they suggest, was not a sudden revolution, but a slow, grinding struggle that took decades. However, most historians believe that the new economic reality was simply too powerful for any law to contain. The Statute of Labourers was almost impossible to enforce. There were not enough royal officials to police every village and every wage negotiation. And more importantly, the lords themselves were incentivized to break the law. A lord might publicly agree with the statute, but if he was truly desperate for workers to bring in his harvest, he would quietly offer you an illegal, above pre-plague rate wage under the table to lure you away from a neighboring manor. The immense, irresistible pressure of supply and demand simply overwhelmed the legislation. The market, in this case, was stronger than the king. You sit outside your cottage in the evening. It's a better cottage than your parents had, with a newly repaired roof that you insisted the Lord fix as part of your tenancy agreement. You have coins, real silver pennies, in a pouch at your belt. Your belly is full of bacon and good ale, a meal of kings for your ancestors. The heavy, invisible yoke of serfdom, the feeling of being bound to this one patch of earth, has been lifted. Your children, you realize, will be born into a world of possibilities that you could never have dreamed of. This strange, unsettling prosperity is built upon a foundation of unimaginable grief and loss, a paradox that sits uneasily in your mind. But it is your new reality. You are no longer just a beast of burden, a serf tied to the soil. You are a man or a woman of value, of means, and with that new wealth, a new and dangerous desire begins to bubble up within you. The desire to look the part. This new impulse will set the stage for a rebellion not of pitchforks, but of fashion, a revolt that will infuriate the old guard and change the very look of society itself. You are no longer just a beast of burden, a serf tied to the soil. You are a man or a woman of value, of means. And with that new wealth, a new and dangerous desire begins to bubble up within you. The desire to look the part. This new impulse will set the stage for a rebellion not of pitchforks, but of fashion, a revolt that will infuriate the old guard and change the very look of society itself. Before the plague, your wardrobe was a uniform of your station, a drab and simple affair designed for durability, not delight. You wore a single, heavy tunic made of coarse, undyed wool, a fabric known as russet. Its color was the color of the sheep it came from, a palette of muddy browns, dull grays, and dirty creams. Beneath this, you wore linen undergarments, if you were lucky. Your shoes were simple leather turn shoes, with no hard sole. Your clothing marked you instantly. It declared to the world, I am a laborer, I work the earth. The idea of fashion, of choosing a color or a style simply because you liked it, was as alien to you as the idea of flying to the moon. But now, you have cash in your pocket. For the first time in your life, you are not just bartering a few eggs for a patch on your sleeve. You are a consumer. You walk into the bustling market of the nearest town, and you see the cloth merchants' stalls piled high with fabrics that once seemed impossibly out of reach. And you indulge, The first and most dramatic change is color. The drab world of browns and grays explodes into vibrant life. With your new wages, you can afford dyed cloth. You might buy a length of wool, dyed a rich, deep blue with the wad plant, a color of startling intensity. Or perhaps you choose a bolt of cloth dyed with madder root, which produces a spectrum of colors from a cheerful orange to a shocking, fiery red. You have your new cloth made into a tunic, and when you wear it for the first time, it is a revelation. To wear color is to feel seen, to feel prosperous, to feel human in a way you never have before. You don't stop there. You can afford better quality fabric now, a finer wool that feels softer against your skin, and you can afford fashionable details. Instead of the simple slits and leather ties that fastened your old clothes, you can now afford buttons. Buttons made of pewter, bone, or even horn were a relatively new and exciting technology, and a long row of them marching down the front of your tunic was a clear and shiny statement of your newfound prosperity. This sartorial revolution does not go unnoticed by the upper classes, and they are utterly, incandescently furious. From the perspective of a knight or a noble lord, your new red tunic is not a source of joy. It is a source of deep anxiety and moral outrage. The medieval world was built on a foundation of rigid, visible hierarchy. You were supposed to be able to tell a person's exact social rank at a single glance, just by looking at their clothes. But now, with wealthy peasants and artisans dressing in fine, colorful fabrics, the lines are blurring. How is a lord to tell the difference between a prosperous farmer and a minor gentleman? If a laborer's wife can afford a fur-trimmed cloak, how does one distinguish her from the wife of a knight? It creates a kind of social vertigo, a sense that the natural order of the world is unraveling. The preachers and moralists of the day thunder about it from the pulpit. They condemn the pride and arrogance of the lower classes. This desire for fine clothes is seen as a sin, a moral failing brought on by the trauma of the plague. Common folk are aping their betters, forgetting their God-given place in the great chain of being, and in doing so, they are inviting God's wrath all over again. This potent mixture of social anxiety and moral panic leads directly to one of the most fascinating legal responses of the post-plague world: the sumptuary laws. The word sumptuary comes from the Latin for consumption or expenditure. These were laws designed to regulate what you could buy, and specifically what you could wear, based on your exact social rank and income. They were a desperate attempt by the ruling class to put the genie of peasant prosperity back in the bottle, to legally enforce the visual distinctions that money had begun to erase. These laws were not vague guidelines. They were astonishingly, obsessively specific. A law might dictate the exact type of fur you were permitted to wear. The wife of a great noble might be allowed to trim her cloak with ermine, the pure white winter fur of a stoat. The wife of a knight might be permitted to wear miniver, the gray and white winter fur of a squirrel. A wealthy merchant's wife might be allowed the fur of a fox. But you, the wife of a farmer, are legally restricted to the fur of a rabbit or a cat. To wear squirrel fur would be a criminal offense. The laws legislated color. The most expensive and vibrant dyes were legally reserved for the highest nobility. True scarlet, a brilliant red derived from the tiny Kermes insect, was often restricted to kings and dukes. The legendary color purple, once derived from sea snails and a symbol of Roman emperors, was the exclusive domain of royalty. If you were caught wearing a color above your station, you could be fined or even have the offending garment confiscated on the spot. Perhaps the most bizarre and famous of all sumptuary regulations concerned the shoes. In the late 14th century, a fashion emerged for ridiculously long, pointed shoes known as poulaines or cracos. The length of the toe became an outrageous symbol of status. The less practical your footwear, the more important you must be. The trend got so out of hand that sumptuary laws were passed to regulate the length of your shoe points based on your social class. A prince might be allowed a point of up to 2 feet long, so long that it had to be tied up to the knee with a small chain to avoid tripping. A knight or an esquire might be limited to a point of 1 foot. A merchant could have a point of 6 inches, and you, the common laborer, were forbidden from wearing them at all. One can only imagine the difficulty of going up a flight of stairs when your shoes arrived a full 2 seconds before the rest of your body. So what was the real motivation behind these obsessive, almost comical laws? Was it all just a panicked attempt to keep the social order from collapsing? Or was there something else at play? Historians still argue about the true purpose of sumptuary legislation. Was it a social tool, or was it an economic one? The argument for social order is strong. The laws were a clear, if heavy-handed, attempt to restore the visual grammar of a hierarchical society. In a world where a skilled peasant could suddenly earn more than a parish priest, clothing was the last and most visible battleground for enforcing class distinctions. For the nobility, it was a genuine effort to prevent the world from descending into a confusing social chaos where a farmer could be mistaken for a lord. However, many historians now point to a more cynical economic motive. If you look closely at the laws, they often forbid the purchase of specific imported luxury goods. A law might restrict the wearing of fine silk from Italy or elaborate brocades from the East. At the same time, the laws often encourage the use of high-quality fabrics produced domestically, like fine English wool. This suggests that the sumptuary laws were also a form of economic protectionism. By discouraging the purchase of expensive foreign goods, they kept English money within England and protected the powerful domestic wool and cloth industries from overseas competition. It was a clever piece of trade policy, disguised as a law about morality and social order. In the end, did these laws actually work? For the most part, no. Like the statute of laborers that tried to control wages, the sumptuary laws were widely ignored and nearly impossible to enforce. The desire for fashion, for status, for the simple human pleasure of wearing something beautiful was far more powerful than the threat of a fine. People found clever ways to flout the rules. A merchant might wear a legally compliant, plain woolen cloak in public, but have it lined with outrageously expensive and illegal imported silk, a secret luxury visible only when he chose to reveal it. The fashion rebellion continued, a quiet but persistent signal of a changing world. You stand before a small mirror of polished steel, a luxury you could not have afforded a few years ago. You admire your reflection. You are wearing a new tunic, dyed a brilliant shade of blue that your grandfather, in his drab-brown russet, would have considered the color of the Virgin Mary's robes, a color reserved for saints and queens. Down the front is a row of shiny pewter buttons you bought with the silver pennies you earned with your own hands. Your new shoes, while not as comically pointed as a nobleman's, are far more stylish than the simple turn shoes of your youth. This transformation of your appearance is more than just vanity. It is a quiet but firm rebellion. It is a visual declaration that the old world is over, and you are a part of the new one. But this rebellion of clothing and wages, this newfound prosperity and confidence, were merely the surface tremors of a much deeper earthquake. The pestilence hadn't just shattered the economic order of the manor. It had cracked the very foundations of the ultimate authority in your life, the institution that held the keys to heaven and hell, the church. But this rebellion of clothing and wages, this newfound prosperity and confidence, were merely the surface tremors of a much deeper earthquake. The pestilence hadn't just shattered the economic order of the manor. It had cracked the very foundations of the ultimate authority in your life, the institution that held the keys to heaven and hell, the church. Before the plague, The authority of the Roman Catholic Church was as solid and omnipresent as the sky above you. It was not something you questioned. It was the very framework of your reality. The Church marked the passage of time with its calendar of feast days and saints' days. It explained the mysteries of the universe, from the creation of the world to the promise of the afterlife. The tolling of the church bell was the clock that governed your day. The local parish priest was the most important man in your village, a figure of immense power who held the keys to your eternal salvation. The Pope in Rome was God's own representative on earth, his word infallible. The Church was the largest landowner in Europe, a political and economic superpower. Its authority was, in a word, absolute. Then the great pestilence arrived, and the Church, for the first time in centuries, was faced with a catastrophe it could not explain, control, or conquer. At first, its response was predictable and traditional. The priests and bishops told you what you expected to hear, that the plague was a divine punishment for the sins of mankind. The world had become corrupt, filled with pride, greed, and lechery, and this was God's terrible judgment. The solution, they preached, was penance. You were to pray harder, attend more masses, confess your sins, and make generous donations to the church to fund prayers for the souls of the dead. Great public processions were organized, where the entire community would march through the streets, flagellating themselves and begging for God's mercy, but none of it worked. The prayers seemed to vanish into a silent heaven. The masses were held in half-empty churches as the parishioners died off. The religious processions, which brought huge crowds of people into close, breathing contact, often seemed to spread the disease even faster. And most damningly, the plague was utterly indiscriminate. It struck down innocent children and devout priests just as readily as it struck down thieves and blasphemers. The very idea that this was a targeted punishment for sin began to seem hollow and absurd when you watched your pious, God-fearing neighbors die in agony, while a notorious sinner in the next village survived without so much as a cough. The Church, the one institution whose entire purpose was to act as humanity's intercessor with God, had failed. Its prayers were ineffective. Its explanations were unconvincing. Its powerlessness was laid bare for all to see. This crisis was compounded by a disaster within the Church's own ranks. The clergy, particularly the parish priests, were on the front lines of the epidemic. They were the ones who had to go into the houses of the sick to hear final confessions. They were the ones who had to administer the last rites, anointing the bodies of the dying. They were the ones who had to perform the endless harrowing burial services. They acted, for the most part, with incredible bravery, fulfilling their sacred duties in the face of near-certain death. As a result, they died in enormous numbers, often at a far higher rate than the general population. While this was a testament to their faith, it had a catastrophic effect on the institution. The Church lost a huge portion of its most experienced, most educated, and most devout members in a single stroke. In the years after the first wave, there was a desperate shortage of priests. To fill the thousands of empty parishes, bishops were forced to lower their standards dramatically. They began to hastily ordain men who were young, ill-prepared, and often poorly educated. Your old priest might have been a wise man who had been in the village for 40 years. Your new priest might be a 20-year-old who can barely stumble his way through the Latin of the Mass, and seems far more interested in collecting the parish tithes than in the spiritual well-being of his flock. This led to a growing and widespread anti-clericalism, deep disrespect for the clergy as flawed, greedy men, which existed alongside a continuing faith in God. You might still believe in the holy sacraments, but you had lost a great deal of respect for the man administering them. So how did you, the average survivor, process this spiritual earthquake? Did this profound disillusionment with the Church lead you to abandon God altogether? Or did it, paradoxically, drive you into an even more fervent and personal search for faith? This is a central question that historians still argue about, because the evidence from the time points in two completely opposite directions. For some, The lesson of the plague was that God was either dead or simply didn't care. The world was ending. The authorities were useless, and prayer was pointless. This led to a desperate hedonistic response, an attitude of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, in his great work The Decameron, described how some citizens of Florence, seeing the social order collapse, gave themselves over to pleasures of every kind. They abandoned their homes and families, spent their days and nights in taverns, and indulged in every fleshly desire, believing that all moral laws were suspended in the face of the apocalypse. If the world was going to end, they were going to enjoy the ride. But for many others, the reaction was the polar opposite. The failure of the church as an institution did not mean the failure of God. In fact, it suggested that the formal, ritualized religion practiced by the clergy was not enough. The disaster proved that you could not simply outsource your salvation to a priest. This led to a powerful surge in personal piety. People began to seek a more direct, unmediated relationship with God. They formed lay brotherhoods, known as confraternities, dedicated to private prayer and charitable works. Wealthy individuals endowed private chapels and paid for personal priests, wanting to take control of their own spiritual destiny. There was a growing hunger to understand the Word of God for oneself, which fueled a demand for religious texts written not in impenetrable Latin, but in the vernacular, the common language of the people. This intensely personal and questioning form of faith would, in time, lay the crucial groundwork for the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later. This search for new spiritual solutions also manifested in the heavens. For centuries, you had prayed to your local patron saint or to the Virgin Mary for protection, but they had failed you. The plague had raged on, deaf to the old prayers, and so people began to turn to new, more specialized celestial protectors. The plague saints. The most famous of these was Saint Roch, a French pilgrim from the 14th century who, according to legend, had contracted the plague but survived. Having been miraculously healed by a dog who licked his sores, he became an overnight superstar of the saintly world. You would see his image everywhere, instantly recognizable as he is always depicted pointing to a single gruesome bubble on his upper thigh, the mark of the disease he had conquered. Another was Saint Sebastian, an ancient Roman martyr who was tied to a tree and shot with arrows. In the medieval mind, the random, piercing nature of the plague felt like being struck by invisible arrows from heaven. So Sebastian became a natural patron for plague sufferers. This turn towards new, specialist saints was a clear vote of no confidence in the old spiritual guardians. It was like your family doctor had failed you, so now you were desperately seeking out a specialist for a second opinion. All of these currents, the failure of the institutional church, the poor quality of the new clergy, the rise of personal piety, the turn to new saints contributed to a slow, subtle, but irreversible erosion of the church's absolute authority. You, the survivor, have looked into the abyss and seen the church look back, powerless. You have seen that priests are just men, made of the same fragile flesh as you. You have whispered prayers that were met with a deafening silence from heaven. A seed of doubt, a kernel of critical thought, has been planted in your mind. You still believe in God. You still consider yourself a faithful Christian. But you are no longer willing to accept the pronouncements of the church without question. You might find yourself listening a little more closely to a traveling preacher who criticizes the immense wealth and corruption of the bishops. You might start to believe that your own heartfelt prayer, whispered in your own cottage, is just as powerful as the Latin Mass mumbled by your uninspiring new priest. You stand inside your small parish church, a place that was once the unwavering center of your world. But it feels different now. It is half empty, and the silence between the priest's words seems to stretch on forever. The faces of the saints in the stained glass windows seem to stare back at you, their expressions unchanged, offering no answers. The old, simple certainties are gone, replaced by a confusing, troubling mixture of faith and disillusionment. For most people, this quiet, internal crisis of faith was a slow-burning fire. But for some, this intense spiritual anxiety exploded outwards in a shocking, bloody, and public spectacle of the most bizarre and extreme religious movements of the entire Middle Ages. The public penance of the flagellants. For most people, this quiet, internal crisis of faith was a slow-burning fire, a private disillusionment that simmered beneath the surface of their daily lives. But for some, the sheer scale of the horror, the overwhelming sense of God's anger and the church's failure, demanded a response that was anything but quiet. For them, the spiritual anxiety of the age exploded outwards in a shocking, bloody, and public spectacle of the most bizarre and extreme religious movements of the entire Middle Ages. You now bear witness to the coming of the flagellants. You hear them before you see them. It starts as a faint sound on the road, a low, rhythmic chanting that grows steadily louder, punctuated by the mournful ringing of a handbell. A procession is approaching your town. A crowd gathers, a nervous energy buzzing through the people. This is not a merchant's caravan or a nobleman's entourage. This is something else entirely. As they come into view, a hush falls over the crowd. Marching 2 by 2, a long column of figures snakes its way towards your market square. They are men, dressed only in simple white loincloths that leave their chests and backs completely bare. Many have their faces obscured by hoods, their identities hidden. Their shoulders are covered with a short cape embroidered with red crosses, signifying their pilgrimage of pain. They are singing hymns of penitence, their voices rising in a sorrowful chant. These are the brothers of the cross, the flagellants. These are not priests or monks bound by official holy orders. They are lay people. They are bakers, weavers, farmers, and merchants from other towns who have abandoned their homes, their families, and their livelihoods to join this radical traveling movement. Their core belief is simple and terrifying. The great pestilence is God's wrath visited upon a sinful world. The formal prayers and rituals of the established church have proven useless. Therefore, they reason. The only thing that can appease this divine anger is an extreme and personal act of penance, a voluntary offering of blood and pain to imitate the suffering of Christ on the cross. They believe that by punishing their own flesh, they can save the world's soul. They are, in their own minds, taking the sins of humanity onto their own backs. The procession enters the town square and arranges itself into a large circle. You and your fellow townspeople press in, a mixture of awe, pity, and morbid fascination churning in your stomach. A leader, a self-proclaimed master of the group, steps into the center of the circle. He delivers a fiery, impassioned sermon. He speaks of the apocalypse, of the sins of pride and greed that have brought this doom upon you all. He might even direct his anger towards the established church, criticizing the wealth of the bishops and the corruption of the priests who failed to protect their flock. His voice rings out, stoking the crowd's fear and guilt. Then, the ritual begins. At a signal from the master, the men in the circle drop to their knees in prayer. Then they rise, and as one, they produce their instruments of penance. Each man holds a scourge, a fearsome whip designed for a single brutal purpose. This is not a simple lash. It is a wooden handle from which hang 3 or more leather thongs, and knotted into the end of each tail, or sometimes forged directly onto it, is a sharp, cruel piece of iron. It might be a simple, star-shaped stud, or it might be a small, wickedly curved hook, designed not just to strike the skin, but to tear it. The master begins a new hymn, and the men begin to whip themselves. They lash the scourges over their shoulders, the iron tips biting into the flesh of their backs and chests. They move in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic motion, chanting along with the hymn as they flagellate themselves. Some whip the man in front of them, turning the act into a communal punishment. The sound is sickening. The wet thud of the leather, the sharp click of the iron, punctuated by the groans of pain from the participants. Soon, their backs are crisscrossed with bleeding wounds, the white loincloths spattered with red. This is not a brief symbolic act. The ritual would continue for a set period, and the flagellants would often remain in a town for over a month, performing their public penance 2 or 3 times a day. So what was this bizarre and bloody spectacle truly about? Was it a genuine, if terrifyingly misguided, expression of extreme faith? Or was it something more dangerous, a movement that threatened to spiral out of control? This is a question historians still argue about. What was the true nature and trajectory of the flagellant movement? On one hand, it's clear that at its origin, the movement was born of sincere, if extreme, piety. The participants were not sadists. They were true believers who felt the weight of the world's sin on their shoulders. They were convinced that their personal sacrifice, their shared suffering, was the only thing that could avert the apocalypse. The movement had a strict set of rules. Members had to swear an oath to participate for 33.5 days, symbolizing the years of Christ's life. They were forbidden from speaking to women, from bathing, or from changing their clothes. They also had to have enough of their own money to pay for their food, to prove they were not beggars or vagabonds. In its own way, it was a highly disciplined, if temporary, religious order. However, as the movement swelled in size and traveled across Germany and the Low Countries, it began to change. Its apocalyptic fervor and dramatic rituals attracted less stable followers. The message of the flagellant masters often became more radical and more openly hostile to the established church. They preached that their blood-drenched ritual was more powerful and sacred than the sacraments of the church. They claimed to be able to forgive sins, a power reserved exclusively for ordained priests. In some towns, their arrival ignited social unrest. Inspired by their anti-clerical rhetoric, townspeople might attack the local clergy or loot the homes of wealthy churchmen. The movement began to look less like a procession of penitents and more like a revolutionary mob, a hysterical, traveling challenge to the entire social and religious order. It's the classic historical progression from grassroots spiritual movement to angry, populist mob. Naturally, the established church, which had initially been somewhat tolerant of this explosion of public piety, became alarmed. The Pope and his bishops saw the flagellants not as allies, but as a dire threat. This was a movement that operated completely outside of their control. These were laymen, usurping the authority and the rituals of the priesthood. They were claiming a direct line to God that bypassed the church entirely, and they were actively stirring up hatred against the clergy. In October of 1349, Pope Clement issued a papal bull, a formal decree, condemning the flagellant movement in the strongest possible terms. He declared their doctrines to be heretical, their rituals to be presumptuous, and their effect on society to be dangerous. He accused them of being in league with the devil and commanded both secular and religious authorities to suppress them. The Pope's condemnation was the beginning of the end. Once declared heretics, the flagellants were no longer seen as holy men, but as dangerous subversives. Secular rulers, who were already wary of these traveling bands of armed, organized men, now had the religious justification they needed to crack down. They began to forbid the flagellants from entering their cities. The movement was also a victim of its own success, or rather, its own failure. Its entire purpose was to stop the plague, but by 1350, the first great wave of the plague was burning itself out naturally. With the immediate threat receding, the desperate need for such an extreme response began to fade. Hunted by the church, rejected by the authorities, and with its primary motivation gone, the flagellant movement fizzled out almost as quickly and dramatically as it had appeared. The flagellants have now marched out of your town, heading towards the next, leaving the market square stained with their blood and the populace buzzing with an uneasy mixture of fear and excitement. What? You are left with a powerful and deeply disturbing memory. You have seen religious faith pushed to its absolute physical and psychological limit. You have witnessed a direct, popular, and violent challenge to the authority of the church, a challenge born from the deepest pits of desperation and terror. This shocking public performance of pain was one way the survivors of the plague tried to process and control the trauma that had shattered their world. But there was another, quieter, and ultimately much more enduring way that this new morbid reality began to express itself. The specter of death now haunted the European imagination, and it would soon begin to dance, silently and menacingly, across the walls of your churches and the pages of your books. This shocking public performance of pain was one way the survivors of the plague tried to process and control the trauma that had shattered their world. But there was another, quieter, and ultimately much more enduring way that this new morbid reality began to express itself. The violent, fleeting spectacle of the flagellants faded away, but the specter of death now haunted the European imagination. It took root in the mind and began to grow. And soon it would begin to dance, silently and menacingly, across the walls of your churches and the pages of your book. Before the pestilence, death was, of course, a constant presence in medieval life and art. But it was often depicted in a solemn, majestic, or even hopeful way. You might see a carving of a soul being gently lifted to heaven by angels, or a serene effigy of a knight sleeping peacefully on his tomb. Death was a transition, a serious but natural part of a divine plan. But after the plague, that all changed. Death was no longer a distant, solemn concept. It had become a grotesque, intimate, and deeply personal reality. It had acquired a new and horrible face, and artists now felt compelled to show it. The first stirrings of this new morbidity can be seen in a story that became incredibly popular in the post-plague years: the legend of the three living and the three dead. You might see it painted as a fresco on the wall of your parish church, or depicted in a richly illuminated prayer book belonging to a wealthy patron. The image is stark and unforgettable. On one side, you see three young, handsome noblemen. They are in the prime of their lives, dressed in the most fashionable and expensive clothes, a direct violation of those sumptuary laws we discussed. They are out enjoying themselves, perhaps hunting or hawking, the picture of worldly vanity and arrogance. Then, on the other side of the image, they are confronted by a terrifying vision. Barring their path are three decaying corpses, standing upright and animated with a horrible life. These are not just random dead bodies. They are their future selves. The artist might depict them in stages of decay. One is freshly dead, his flesh still intact but pale and bloated. The second is rotting, his skin sloughing off to reveal the muscles and sinews beneath. The third is a bare, grinning skeleton. These three dead men speak to the three living nobles, and a scroll of text often unfurls from their mouths with a chilling message: Quod fuimus estis, quod sumus vos eritis. As we were, you are. As we are, you will be. It is a blunt and brutal memento mori, a reminder that youth, wealth, and power are fleeting illusions, and that the physical reality of decay awaits everyone. This wasn't a gentle reminder. It was a direct, terrifying confrontation with your own future putrefaction. This powerful motif, this idea of the animated dead coming to confront the living, soon evolved into something even grander and more universal. It became the great artistic theme of the late Middle Ages, the dance macabre, or the dance of death. This was no longer just a warning to three young nobles. This was an invitation to the entire world to join in one final, grim procession. Imagine a long mural painted across the inside or outside of a church wall, or a series of woodcut prints in a popular book. The scene is a long, snaking dance. And leading the dance, grabbing the hands of the living and pulling them along, is death itself. Death is not a cloaked, shadowy figure with a sigh. It is an animated, often gleeful, skeleton. Sometimes it is a desiccated corpse, its dry skin stretched tight over its bones. It is grinning. It is dancing. It is playing a musical instrument, and it is irresistible. The true power of the dance macabre lies in who is being forced to join this terrible conga line. The artist meticulously depicts people from every single level of the social hierarchy, a concept you know has become so unstable. Death first takes the hand of the most powerful man on earth, the Pope, who is shown recoiling in terror, his tall, three-tiered crown offering him no protection. Next in line is the Holy Roman Emperor, his earthly authority utterly meaningless. Then comes the king, the cardinal, the powerful duke, and the proud knight in his armor. Death mocks them, tugging at their fine silk robes and ignoring their pleas. The message is clear. Your wealth and power cannot save you. But the dance doesn't stop there. After humbling the great, death continues down the social ladder. It grabs the hand of the wealthy merchant, the learned physician, the clever lawyer. It pulls the humble craftsman from his workshop, the alewife from her tavern, and you, the peasant, from your plow. Most chillingly, the dance includes the innocent and the helpless. Death leads away a young maiden, a small child playing with a toy, and even a baby from its cradle. No one is exempt. The dance is a stark and powerful visual representation of what you have just lived through. Death is the great equalizer. In the face of the plague, everyone was equal, and in the grave, everyone is equal. It's the ultimate expression of the phrase, "We're all in this together," though not in a particularly uplifting way. So, what was the artist and the patron who paid for the work trying to say with this grim and morbid parade? This is a point on which historians still argue. Was the dance macabre a truly subversive and revolutionary piece of social commentary, meant to challenge the existing power structures? Or was it, at its heart, a deeply conservative and religious message, meant to reinforce the faith? The argument for social subversion is compelling. There is a clear delight in these artworks in seeing the mighty brought low. The skeletons are often shown gleefully mocking the powerful, tripping the king, or stealing the Pope's hat. For the common person looking at this mural, it could have been a form of vicarious revenge, a satisfying reminder that for all his wealth and arrogance, the lord of the manor would one day be nothing more than a pile of bones, just like you. It was a visual confirmation that the rigid social hierarchy was, in the grand scheme of things, a meaningless illusion. On the other hand, many historians argue that the primary message was one of traditional piety. The dance wasn't meant to say, "Don't be a king." It was meant to say, even if you are a king, you must repent. The purpose of the art was not to foment social revolution, but to scare every single person, regardless of their station, into living a better Christian life. It was a constant public reminder that your time on earth is short, and that eternal judgment awaits. The dance doesn't end at the grave. It ends at the throne of God. In this view, the dance macabre ultimately reinforces the religious worldview, urging a return to piety in the face of life's terrifying fragility. This was not a niche art form hidden away in a private collection. It was public art, designed for the masses. You would see it painted in enormous murals on the walls of parish churches, where you would be confronted with it every Sunday. It was painted in the cloisters of monasteries, and, most appropriately, on the walls surrounding cemeteries. One of the most famous examples was a massive and celebrated mural at the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris, a place of constant traffic and public life. With the advent of the printing press, the dance macabre became a popular subject for woodcut illustrations in cheap, accessible books. Whether you were literate or not, this was an image you would have seen, and its message was impossible to misunderstand. The artistic style itself is often as unsettling as the subject matter. The figures are typically not realistic portraits, but are instead archetypes. The bishop, the merchant, the farmer. But the skeletons are depicted with a horrifying energy. They are not static anatomical diagrams. They are alive. They leap, they cavort. They pull their partners along with a gleeful, manic, and unstoppable force. They are animated by a terrible joy. The effect on you, the medieval viewer, is one of profound and chilling recognition. This art gives a face to the random, senseless death you have all witnessed. It validates your shared trauma, while at the same time delivering its stark warning. You stand in the cool air of your parish church, looking up at the freshly painted mural that now covers the north wall. You trace the grim, dancing procession with your eyes. You see the Pope, his face a mask of horror. You see the King, his crown askew. And there, near the end of the line, you see a figure leaning on a spade, his face weary and resigned. You see yourself. You see your Lord. You see your priest. All of you are different in life, but all of you are held in the same, inescapable, bony grasp. The deep, unspoken trauma of the plague has been given a form, a grinning, skeletal face that dances and beckons. The dances? This morbid new art is a way of coping, of processing, of making a terrible kind of sense of the senseless. But it raises a deeper question. If faith and art were being so profoundly reshaped by the memory of the pestilence, what about the formal, learned science that had failed so spectacularly to explain or cure it? The old medical certainties had crumbled into dust, and in that rubble, a new and tentative path forward was just beginning to emerge. The specter of death now haunted the European imagination, and it would soon begin to dance, silently and menacingly, across the walls of your churches and the pages of your books. This morbid new art was a way of coping, of making sense of the senseless. But it raises a deeper question. If faith and art were being so profoundly reshaped by the memory of the pestilence, what about the formal, learned science that had failed so spectacularly to explain or cure it? The old medical certainties had crumbled into dust, and in that rubble, a new and tentative path forward was just beginning to emerge. To understand the crisis in medieval medicine, you must first understand the man at its pinnacle, the university-trained physician. He was a figure of immense prestige, a man of deep and formidable learning. But his learning was of a very specific kind. He did not learn his craft by observing sick people or by studying the anatomy of the human body. He learned it by reading books. His entire education was based on the meticulous study of ancient texts, primarily the works of the Greek physician Galen, who had lived over 1,000 years earlier. These texts, preserved and expanded upon by Arab scholars, were treated not as historical documents, but as infallible gospel. For a medieval physician, the ultimate medical truth was not to be found in the patient lying in front of him, but on a dusty page of Latin. His entire worldview was based on the theory of the four humors, that elegant system of balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The physician's job was not to diagnose a specific disease, but to determine which of the four humors was out of balance in his wealthy patient. His diagnostic tools were not the stethoscope or the microscope. He would gaze intently at the color and turbidity of a patient's urine, collected in a special flask. He would consult complex astrological charts to see how the alignment of the planets might be affecting the patient's humors. He would ask questions about diet and dreams. He would rarely, if ever, actually touch the patient. His was a clean intellectual and theoretical practice, which was a great job if you enjoyed intellectual puzzles, but weren't overly fond of sick people. Then the Black Death arrived, and this entire elaborate intellectual structure collapsed in on itself. The plague was a monster that could not be found in the pages of Galen. It defied all the neat categories of humoral theory. It had symptoms of both heat, like a raging fever, and cold, like the dark necrotic buboes that gave it its name. It struck people of every humoral complexion, from the cheerful and ruddy sanguine to the dour and pale melancholic. It made no sense. The treatments derived from the theory were, therefore, utterly useless. A physician might diagnose a patient's fever as an excess of hot blood and prescribe bloodletting to cool them down, a procedure which only weakened the patient further. He might see the buboes as a form of poison and prescribe a powerful purgative to expel it, a treatment that often led to fatal dehydration. He would advise his patients to eat cold foods like lettuce and fish, or hot foods like peppers and wine. But the plague cared not for his dietary prescriptions. The learned physician, the man with all the answers from his ancient books, stood before the pestilence, and for the first time, he had no answers at all. His authority, so absolute just a few years before, was shattered. With the university-trained doctors so thoroughly discredited, a subtle shift in the medical hierarchy began. People started to place more trust in the practitioners who actually worked with their hands and dealt with the messy realities of the human body. The surgeon, long considered a mere manual laborer, a kind of glorified butcher who was intellectually inferior to the physician, saw his status rise. A surgeon knew how to lance a boil, and a plague bobo was, in essence, a giant deadly boil. His practical skills suddenly seemed more relevant than the physician's abstract theories. Likewise, the apothecary, the man who actually mixed the herbal remedies, gained prestige. His knowledge was based on a practical, if not always effective, tradition of herbalism, not on ancient texts. This new demand for immediate practical knowledge led to the birth of a whole new literary genre, the plague treatise. With the great heavy Latin tomes of medicine having proven useless, people were desperate for accessible information. In response, doctors, surgeons, and even educated lay people began to write short pamphlets and treatises specifically about the plague. The most revolutionary thing about these documents was that they were very often written in the vernacular in English, French, German, or Italianate in academic Latin. This was a radical democratization of medical knowledge. For the first time, a literate merchant or artisan could read and understand medical advice for himself. These treatises were a fascinating mix of sensible public health advice, humoral theory, and pure superstition. They would often give the now famous advice to flee soon, flee far, and return late, which was, in fact, the single most effective preventative measure. They advised people to avoid bathing, based on the fear that hot water would open the pores of the skin and allow the poisonous air, the miasma, to enter the body. They recommended carrying a pomander, a ball of sweet-smelling herbs and resins, to hold to your nose in foul-smelling areas, creating a protective bubble of good air. They gave detailed lists of foods to eat and avoid, still rooted in humoral theory. It was a hodgepodge of ideas, but it was practical, it was accessible, and it represented a shift away from pure theory towards public health information. The plague also presented the medical world with a grim and unprecedented resource, a seemingly infinite supply of dead bodies. This has led to a major question that historians still argue about. Did the Black Death lead to a surge in the practice of human dissection, shattering old taboos and kickstarting the anatomical revolution we associate with the Renaissance? The argument that it did seems logical. Some physicians, desperate to understand the cause of the pestilence, did perform autopsies on plague victims, cutting them open to find the source of the illness within the body. We have records from the time of doctors noting the state of the lungs or the inflammation of the internal organs. Public dissections at universities, while still very rare, may have become slightly more common as professors tried to demonstrate the physical effects of the disease to their students. It seems plausible that this massive confrontation with death would have forced a new interest in the inner workings of the human body. However, most historians are now skeptical that the plague caused a sudden, dramatic increase in dissection. The primary obstacle was the overwhelming fear of contagion. The idea of cutting open the body of a plague victim, of exposing oneself to the fluids and tissues riddled with the disease, would have been terrifying to all but the most reckless. Furthermore, the powerful religious and social taboos against violating the sanctity of the human body were still very much in place. While some investigative autopsies certainly occurred, the evidence suggests that the widespread, systematic study of anatomy did not truly begin until more than a century later, with figures like Andreas Vesalius. The anatomical revolution was a slower, more complex evolution, not a sudden result of the plague. Even so, it is undeniable that the Black Death planted the seeds of a medical transformation. It had proven, in the most brutal way imaginable, the catastrophic failure of a medical system based entirely on slavish devotion to ancient authority. It had shown that theory without observation was useless in the face of a new reality. It had elevated the status of the hands-on, practical surgeon and created a public appetite for accessible medical knowledge. And it had introduced, through quarantine measures and public sanitation efforts, the very concept of public health. The word quarantine itself is a direct legacy of this period, coming from the Italian quaranta giorni, the 40 days that ships had to wait at anchor in the harbor of Venice before their crews and passengers would be allowed ashore to prove they allowed ashore. We're not carrying the pestilence. You look at the university physician, a man your parents would have regarded with unquestioning awe, and you see him with new, critical eyes. You have seen that his complex charts, his obscure Latin quotations, and his deep knowledge of Galen could not save your family or your village. You are now more inclined to trust the practical advice of the local surgeon, or the herbal wisdom of the old woman at the edge of town, or the guidance printed in a new pamphlet you can actually read for yourself. The absolute, unshakable authority of ancient text-based medicine has been broken. A space has been cleared, a space created by catastrophic failure and unimaginable grief, a new kind of medicine to eventually, slowly, take root. It would be a medicine based not on what was written in a book 1,000 years ago, but on what could be seen, touched, and observed in the suffering and struggling human body itself. This tentative shift was a process that would take centuries, and it was constantly hampered by a crushing, soul-destroying fact that the survivors had to face. The plague was not a one-time apocalyptic event. It was not, in fact, over. This tentative shift was a process that would take centuries, and it was constantly hampered by a crushing, soul-destroying fact that the survivors had to face. The plague was not a one-time apocalyptic event. It was not, in fact, over. It had simply taken a breath. In the years immediately following 1351, a fragile and deceptive sense of recovery took hold. You, the survivor, are at the center of this new world. You have lived through the greatest catastrophe in living memory, and you have emerged on the other side into a strange, empty, but opportunity-rich landscape. You are enjoying the benefits of the new economic reality. You might have taken over the lease on a larger, better plot of land, abandoned by a family that vanished. You are earning cash wages for your labor, and with that cash, you are eating better food and wearing better clothes than your parents could have ever imagined. You might have married another survivor, and in the quiet hope that the worst is truly over, you have had children. This new generation, born into a less crowded, more prosperous world, represents the future. They are the green shoots of life pushing up through the ashes of the old world. You dare to feel a flicker of optimism. Then, in the year 1361, a decade after the first great wave receded, the rumors begin to trickle in from the port cities. The sickness is back. At first, you might dismiss it. The plague was a singular event, a great storm that came and went. It cannot come again. But the rumors grow more persistent, and then a case appears in a neighboring village. A cold, familiar dread begins to creep back into your heart. This is not the terror of the unknown that you felt the first time. This is worse. This is the terror of the known. You know exactly what the fever means. You know what the appearance of the dark, swollen buboes signifies. You know the swift and almost certain trajectory from sickness to death. This second great outbreak, which swept across Europe in 1361 and 1362, was different. Observers at the time gave it a particularly cruel name, pestis puerorum, the plague of the children. While it killed people of all ages, it seemed to fall with a particular vengeance upon the young. It targeted the very generation that had been born since the first pestilence, the children who had no memory of the initial horror and who had no acquired immunity. This was a unique and exquisite form of psychological torture for the survivors. The generation of hope, the children born to repopulate the empty world, were being scythed down. You might have survived the first plague, only to watch your own children, the very symbols of your resilience, succumb to the second. It was as if the plague had returned with a sharp and malicious intelligence, specifically to crush any burgeoning sense of optimism. While this second wave was not quite as widespread or as deadly as the first apocalyptic outbreak, its psychological impact was immense. It established a new and terrible pattern. It proved that the Black Death was not a singular event. It was a new, permanent feature of the European environment. The plague had become endemic. It settled into the local rat and rodent populations, and from there it would emerge with terrifying regularity to ravage the human population. This became the new rhythm of life for the next 3 centuries. After the plague of the children, another major outbreak occurred in 1369, then again in 1374. And so on, a relentless cycle of pestilence returning roughly every 5 to 15 years. Sometimes an outbreak would be localized, hitting only a specific region or a handful of cities. Other times, it would be a major pandemic, sweeping across the entire continent once again. You now live your entire life under the shadow of this recurring terror. It is no longer a question of if the plague will return, but when. It's like living on a major earthquake fault line, but the big one arrives every single decade. It creates a culture of endemic fear, a society afflicted with a kind of collective post-traumatic stress disorder that is passed down from one generation to the next. This relentless, century-spanning pattern of death had a profound effect on the population of Europe. What did it mean for society when it was never allowed to fully recover? This is a central question that historians still argue about. What were the long-term demographic consequences of these recurring plagues? One school of thought argues that the wandering plague kept the European population in a state of permanent depression for centuries. Every time a generation of recovery would allow the population to begin to grow, another wave of the plague would sweep through and mercilessly cull the numbers again. According to this view, Europe's population did not return to its pre-1347 levels until the 16th or even the 17th century. The golden age of the peasant, with its high wages and abundant land, was maintained for so long precisely because the labor pool was never allowed to fully recover. The economic power of the common person was a direct result of this long-term demographic stagnation caused by recurring disease. Other historians, however, argue for a more resilient and adaptive model. While acknowledging the horror and devastation of the recurring outbreaks, they suggest that society found ways to cope. People began to marry younger. Women who were widowed in one outbreak would remarry quickly. Birth rates in the years between plagues may have been unusually high, as people tried to consciously rebuild their families and communities. While the plague certainly acted as a brutal check on population growth, This view suggests that the rebound in the intervening years might have been more robust than the grim chronicles suggest. Society, in this model, was not passively enduring the blows, but actively and strategically adapting its social behaviors to survive in this dangerous new world. Imagine what it was like to live through this cycle. As a small child in the 1340s, you witnessed the first great pestilence. You see your parents and grandparents die. You are one of the orphans of the storm. You grow up, marry, and have children of your own during the fragile peace of the 1350s. Then, as a young adult in the 1360s, you face the second great wave, the plague of the children, and you might lose some of your own young sons and daughters. You survive that and enter middle age. In the 1370s or 1380s, the plague returns yet again. This time, you might lose your spouse, your friends, the people you have built your adult life with. The trauma is not a single, distant memory. It is a repeating, layered, and inherited nightmare. Each generation has its own defining plague outbreak, its own story of loss and survival to pass down. It becomes the dark and terrible metronome marking out the beats of your life. But people did not just endure this reality. They adapted to it. The initial chaos and helplessness of the first wave were gradually replaced by more organized and pragmatic responses. The idea of public health, born in the crisis, was slowly refined. Cities, particularly in Italy, established permanent health boards, committees of magistrates given extraordinary powers during an outbreak. They had the authority to shut the city gates, to turn away travelers from infected regions, and to establish quarantines. They would set up pest houses or lazarettosos outside the city walls, where the sick could be forcibly removed and isolated from the healthy population. They issued health passes, documents certifying that a traveler had come from a plague-free area. People learned to read the signs. The sudden appearance of large numbers of dead rats in the streets was recognized as a terrifying omen, a harbinger of the human outbreak to come. The wealthy knew that the best response was to flee. At the first whisper of plague in the city, they would retreat to their isolated country estates, hoping to ride out the storm in clean air, away from the crowded, infected urban centers. This cycle of recurring plague, adaptation, and flight became a new and enduring part of the European experience for centuries to come. You are an old man or an old woman now, sitting by the fire in your small cottage, a great-grandparent who has seen more death than any generation should have to bear. You have outlived your parents, your spouse, some of your children, and nearly all of your friends. You have survived 3, maybe 4 great waves of the pestilence. The sharp, panicked terror of your youth has faded, replaced by a dull, chronic ache in your soul. You have learned that the world is a fragile and dangerous place, and that life is a fleeting gift. You have learned to live with death, not as a distant stranger, but as a constant, unwelcome, and horribly familiar neighbor. This recurring cycle of death and recovery had a profound and lasting impact on the human world, keeping populations low and anxieties high, all while slowly reshaping the economic and social fabric of the continent. But the plague's influence was not limited to humanity. This long-term suppression of the human population also had a dramatic and entirely unexpected effect on the non-human world, on the very landscape of Europe itself. With humanity held in check for century after century, the land began to change, the fields began to shrink, and the forests began to grow back. This recurring cycle of death and recovery had a profound and lasting impact on the human world, keeping populations low and anxieties high, all while slowly reshaping the economic and social fabric of the continent. But the plague's influence was not limited to humanity. This long-term suppression of the human population also had a dramatic and entirely unexpected effect on the non-human world, on the very landscape of Europe itself. With humanity held in check for century, a great retreat began. A great retreat began. The fields started to shrink, and the forests began to grow back. For centuries before the plague, the story of the European landscape had been one of relentless human expansion. The continent's population had boomed, and to feed all those mouths, people had waged a constant war against the wilderness. Forests were cleared, marshes were drained, and hillsides were terraced. Every available scrap of land was put to the plow. But now, that process has been thrown into a sudden and dramatic reverse. With the population cut by a half or more, and with your newfound ability to shop around for the best land, a simple and rational calculation is made all across Europe. There is no longer a need to farm the difficult, marginal lands. Why would you expend the back-breaking effort to cultivate a rocky hillside that yields only a meager crop, when a lush, fertile plot in the river valley now lies empty and available? You and your lord both make the same logical choice. You abandon the poor quality land and consolidate your efforts on the most productive soils. This marks a great human retreat from the landscape, the first of its kind in 1,000 years. And as soon as human effort is withdrawn, nature begins its slow, silent, and inexorable work of reclamation. You can watch this process unfold over the course of your lifetime. A field on the edge of the village, one that your father used to plow, is the first to be abandoned. In the first few years, the neat lines of the furrows disappear under a riot of wildflowers and opportunistic weeds. A vibrant carpet of poppies, cornflowers, thistles, and nettles covers the land where once there was barley. It is, for a time, a beautiful sight. But this is just the first stage. Within 5 or 10 years, the scrubland begins to take over. Hardy, thorny pioneers, like brambles, gorse, and hawthorn bushes, create a dense, impenetrable thicket. The field is no longer a field. It is a rough, tangled wilderness, difficult to walk through. Then, after a decade or two, the true transformation begins. The seeds of pioneer trees, carried on the wind, find purchase in the scrub. Fast-growing, sun-loving trees like birch, with their silvery bark, and aspen, with their trembling leaves, begin to shoot up. They grow quickly, their slender trunks forming the first canopy, shading out the scrub below. Finally, over a much longer period, the slower-growing but more dominant trees arrive. An acorn, planted by a jay, sprouts into a mighty oak. A beechnut takes root. These great trees of the ancient wildwood rise through the pioneer canopy, and over the course of a century, they create a new, mature forest, dark and dense, where your ancestors once harvested their grain. The land has come full circle. The human mark has been erased. In the most extreme cases, it wasn't just individual fields that were abandoned. It was entire villages. A settlement that was hit particularly hard by the plague, losing perhaps 80 or 90% of its people, might become completely unviable. The few survivors would simply pack up and move to a more prosperous, less haunted village nearby, and their old home would be left to the elements. This phenomenon of lost villages, known in Germany by the wonderfully evocative term Wüstungen, created a landscape of ghosts. Imagine a small hamlet of a dozen cottages. After its abandonment, the wattle and daub walls of the houses begin to crumble into the earth. The thatch roofs rot and collapse inward. The village church, built of stone, might stand for a few centuries longer, a lonely sentinel in a growing forest, before it too eventually falls into ruin. The stone foundations of the cottages are slowly covered by soil, leaves, and vegetation. Within 200 years, the village has vanished from sight, leaving only a series of faint, rectangular lumps and bumps in a grassy field, visible only to a trained eye, or perhaps from the air. Modern archaeologists, using tools like aerial photography and remote sensing, have rediscovered hundreds of these lost settlements. Their ghostly outlines a silent map of the plague's devastating impact. One One could make a dark joke that the Black Death was the most effective and ruthless gentrifying force in history, clearing whole neighborhoods for redevelopment by Mother Nature. As the forests returned, so too did the forest creatures. For the wild animals of Europe, the Black Death and its recurring waves were the beginning of a golden age. With a vastly reduced human population, there were fewer hunters and trappers. With the expansion of the forests, there was more habitat. As a result, animal populations exploded. You notice this in your daily life. The herds of deer are larger and bolder than they were in your grandfather's time. Wild boar, once largely confined to the king's private hunting forests, become more common and a more frequent threat to the crops you do still cultivate. And most dramatically, the wolf population resurges. The wolf was the great, primordial enemy of the medieval farmer and shepherd. For centuries, humanity had pushed them back, killing them to protect their precious livestock. Now, with fewer shepherds to guard the flocks, and with more dense forest to hide in, the wolves are making a comeback. Chronicles from the 15th century are filled with complaints about the increased wolf menace, a direct and toothy consequence of the human catastrophe. This retreat from the land also prompted a fundamental shift in agriculture itself. Lords and wealthy peasants, now in control of vast tracts of land that they didn't have the manpower to cultivate for grain, turned to a more efficient and less labor-intensive use for it, raising animals. There was a major, continent-wide shift away from arable farming, growing crops, and towards pastoralism, raising livestock. Sheep farming, in particular, boomed. Wool was a hugely valuable cash commodity, the backbone of the great cloth industries of Flanders and England. It took far fewer people to manage a giant flock of sheep grazing on a hillside than it did to plow, plant, sow, and harvest that same hillside for grain. And so, many of the abandoned fields were not allowed to revert to forest, but were instead kept clear as vast open pastures for thousands upon thousands of sheep. The landscape became emptier, dominated not by villages and fields of grain, but by lone shepherds and their flocks. So what was the total effect of this immense rewilding of the European landscape? How much did the world actually change? This is a question where historians, and now climate scientists, still argue, particularly about the scale and the wider impact of this great reforestation. One of the most fascinating, though still controversial, theories proposes that the Black Death didn't just change Europe, it changed the entire planet's climate. The logic is as follows. Trees, as they grow, absorb huge amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The massive, continent-wide regrowth of forests in the century after the plague would have acted like a giant planetary lung, pulling an immense volume of CO2, a greenhouse gas, out of the air. Some scientists have linked this event directly to the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a period of distinctly cooler global temperatures that began in the 14th and 15th centuries. In this grand, sweeping view, the flea on the back of a black rat in 1347 ultimately helped trigger a global climate event. Other scholars, however, are more cautious. They argue that while the reforestation was undoubtedly real and significant, it was likely more of a patchy and localized phenomenon than a uniform green blanket spreading across the continent. They point out that huge areas were converted to pasture, not forest, which would have had a very different environmental impact. They believe that the causes of the Little Ice Age are far more complex, linked to solar cycles and volcanic activity, and that the effect of the post-plague reforestation was likely negligible on a global scale. The debate itself, however, highlights the sheer magnitude of the event, forcing us to consider that its consequences rippled outwards in ways its survivors could never have possibly imagined. You stand at the edge of a dark wood that you know, from the stories of your grandfather, was once a wide open field of barley. The air here feels different, cooler, and smells of damp earth and moss. The silence is deeper, broken only by the cry of a bird you do not recognize. The world of your ancestors, a landscape tamed and ordered by the human hand for centuries, is gone. It has been replaced by a world that is emptier, quieter, wilder, and more dominated by the raw and patient forces of nature. This profound transformation of the very ground beneath your feet is a powerful physical symbol of the plague's apocalyptic impact. Humanity's tight grip on the continent has been loosened. This new, wilder stage, with its completely new economic, social, and ecological realities, was where the final act of the medieval period would play out, and where the first tentative scenes of a new era were about to begin. This transformed world, with its new economic, social, and even ecological realities, was the stage upon which the final act of the medieval period would play out, and the first tentative scenes of a new era were about to begin. The Black Death, for all its unspeakable horror, was not just an end. It was also a beginning. It was the terrible, violent, and unintentional catalyst that helped dismantle a world that had stood for 1,000 years and cleared the ground for something new to grow. You stand now at a vantage point, able to look back and see the entire tapestry of this transformed world. You can finally trace the threads that connect the initial, silent shock of the empty villages to the dawn of a new age, the great, defining feature of the medieval world. The system of feudalism and serfdom was not brought down by a great war or a peasant army with pitchforks. It was brought down by a bacterium. It was hollowed out from the inside by the sheer, relentless force of mass death. The process, as you have seen, began with the new and startling power of the common laborer. In the empty world left by the plague, your labor became a precious commodity. You, the serf, were able to demand wages, freedom of movement, and better conditions. The old bonds that tied you to the land were dissolved, not by a declaration of emancipation, but by the simple, undeniable mathematics of supply and demand. This economic revolution, born in the graveyard, was the first great crack in the feudal edifice. This newfound wealth led to the fashion rebellion of the sumptuous peasant. When you began to wear bright colors and fine fabrics, you weren't just changing your clothes. You were challenging the visual grammar of the entire social order. The frantic passage of sumptuary laws was the panicked reaction of an elite class that could feel the very ground shifting beneath its feet. They were trying to legislate a reality that no longer existed, to hold back a tide of social mobility with a flimsy wall of words. At the same time, a deeper crisis was unfolding in the spiritual heart of the world. The church, the ultimate authority, had been proven powerless. Its prayers went unanswered, its priests died in droves, and its explanations for the catastrophe rang hollow. This failure opened up a space for questioning, for doubt, and for new forms of personal piety that sought a direct connection with God, bypassing the institutional church. Extreme, explosive movements like the flagellants were a testament to this spiritual desperation, a sign that people were willing to look for salvation in the most radical and unconventional places. The very way you saw the world and your place in it began to change. The art of the dance macabre was not just a morbid fascination with skeletons. It was a powerful new expression of individualism. In the dance of death, you were no longer just a part of a collective group, the peasantry, the clergy, the nobility. You were an individual, alone, facing your own mortality. The art stripped away the comfort of the collective and focused on the stark, personal reality of the human condition. This new focus on the individual, on mortal life rather than just the afterlife, was a cornerstone of the humanist philosophy that would soon blossom. The old pillars of knowledge were cracking too. Learned, university physicians, with their devotion to the ancient texts of Galen and their elaborate humoral theories, had failed as spectacularly as the priests. Their inability to explain or treat the plague created a new, albeit grudging, respect for practical, hands-on knowledge, the knowledge of the surgeon, the apothecary, even the local herbalist. This skepticism towards received ancient authority was a vital first step towards a new age of science based on direct observation and experience. The recurring waves of the plague, the wandering pestilence that returned every decade, ensured that these changes were not temporary. The population was kept low for more than a century, meaning the labor shortage and the high value of the common person became a permanent feature of life, not a brief anomaly. This prevented the old feudal order from ever re-establishing its grip. And all of this played out on a transformed stage, a rewilded landscape where forests were reclaiming the land, a physical manifestation of humanity's loosened control over the world. Amidst all this death, there was a strange birth. With so many of the educated elitity priests, the clerks, the monks, the administrators wiped out, there was a sudden, desperate need for new learning. To fill this vacuum, dozens of new universities were founded all across Europe in the decades following the Black Death. Places like Heidelberg, Krakow, and Pavia were all established in this period. These new institutions were often less bound by the ancient theological traditions of Paris and Bologna. They were created out of a practical need to train a new generation of lawyers, doctors, and civil servants to manage this changed world. They fostered a new intellectual climate, one that was sometimes more secular, more practical, and more open to new ideas than the old guard had been. So we arrive at the great final question. Did the Black Death cause the Renaissance? This is one of the most profound debates in history, and historians still argue about it with great passion. Was the plague a direct and necessary catalyst for the great cultural flowering that followed? The argument for it is powerful. You can see how the plague seems to have created the perfect conditions for the Renaissance to take root. The weakening of the Church's intellectual monopoly allowed for the rise of secular humanism. The new wealth created by the economic shifts produced a new class of patrons in the cities of Italy, wealthy merchants and bankers eager to sponsor art that glorified their own worldly success. The new focus on the individual and the fragility of mortal life, born from the trauma of the plague, led to an art that was more personal, more emotional, and more focused on the beauty and tragedy of the human form. From this perspective, the Black Death, in all its horror, was the dark and fertile soil from which the seeds of the Renaissance sprouted. The counter-argument, however, urges caution. It points out that many of the currents that defined the Renaissance, the rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman texts, the rise of the Italian city-states, the development of new artistic techniques were already well underway before the plague ever arrived in 1347. From this viewpoint, the Renaissance was a separate cultural movement that was happening anyway. The plague was a grim and terrible backdrop to the story, a catastrophe that disrupted and transformed society in countless ways, but it was not the root cause of the shift in art and philosophy. It was a parallel event, not a direct cause. Perhaps the most truthful answer lies somewhere in between. The Black Death was not the single cause of the Renaissance, but it was a brutal and powerful accelerant. It took a world that was already beginning to change and pushed it violently over a cliff. It broke the great rigid institutions of the high Middle Ages feudalism and the universal church beyond repair. It shattered old certainties and forced the survivors to look at their world, their God, and themselves in a new and questioning light. You look back one last time. You see a world emptied by a microscopic predator. You see the survivors picking their way through the ruins, grieving and afraid, but also empowered and emboldened. You see them demanding better wages, wearing brighter clothes, questioning their priests, and creating a new stark art that stared death right in the face. The Black Death was not the end of the world. It was simply the end of a world, and in its wake, it left a space empty, silent, and deeply haunted, but also filled with a strange, frightening, and exhilarating new potential. It left a space for the modern world to begin its slow and complicated birth. And now, our own long journey comes to its end. We have walked through the silent villages and stood before the dancing skeletons on the church walls. We have felt the quiet despair and the strange, unexpected hope of the survivors. The story is told, and the echoes of that distant, broken world can begin to fade, softening into the peaceful quiet of your own room. The immense, world-shattering events, the fall of feudalism, the dawn of the Renaissance can recede now, their sharp, analytical edges blurring and dissolving. Let go of the great sweep of history and simply rest in this present moment. The great silence that fell over the 14th century world is replaced now by the gentle, personal quiet that surrounds you. It is a silence of peace, not of absence. It is a quiet that is full of safety. Feel the simple, solid reality of the bed you are in. It is not a straw pallet in a cold cottage, haunted by the memory of loss. It is your own safe space, in your own time, a place of comfort and security. The air you breathe is clean and carries no fear. The world outside your window is not one of scarcity and sudden death, but one of order and predictability. Let the deep, profound distance between your world and theirs be a source of comfort, a quiet reminder of the peace you inhabit. The trauma of the plague, a wound that festered on the soul of Europe for centuries, is over. The fever has broken, the great convulsive changes have settled, and the world they created has become the world we know. The story has found its resolution. All that is left now is for you to find yours in the gentle, welcoming embrace of sleep. Think of the land, how it rested and grew back. Let your own mind and body feel that same sense of quiet reclamation. Let the busy thoughts of the day be like the abandoned fields, slowly growing over with a soft, green carpet of stillness. Let the anxieties of your own life be like the distant figures of the dance macabre, dancing away into the far-off pages of a book. They are not here with you now. All that remains is the simple, steady rhythm of your own breathing, a quiet and ancient beat that connects you to all the survivors who came before. They too lay down in the darkness after a long and difficult day, and simply breathed, in and out. Let that simple, vital sound be your anchor, pulling you gently away from the shore of wakefulness, out into the deep, calm, and healing waters of sleep. The story is finished. The world is quiet. It is time to rest. Let your mind be still. Let your body be heavy. Let sleep come for you now. Sweet dreams.